Howdy everybody, this is Omar, your Audio Amigo, here with another Audio Amigo review for y'all. This is going to be the third and final episode in my three-part series on bone conduction IEMs. Today on the review table, we're looking at the Apevoix Grit, a 6-driver tri-Brit IEM priced at $230 US. In this series, we've seen bone conduction down at the budget end, we've seen it up at the higher end of the budget range. So today we're going to be looking at the execution at what, in my opinion, is one of the more competitive and popular price ranges, which is sort of $200 to $300. Does the Grit do enough to set itself apart in what is a very, very competitive market? Well, let's find out. Quick disclaimer for y'all. This sample of the Apevoix Grit was sent to me by Linsoul for review. I am not being paid for this review, but because I could turn around and sell this if I wanted, I have activated the paid promotion feature here on YouTube. I do these disclaimers because I believe in full transparency, especially when there's potential bias besides my own personal tastes at play. Thank you to Linsoul for sending me this set for review, and thank you all for your support. Go ahead and start with the unboxing experience, and right off the bat, the Grit does things differently to sort of other IEMs at this price point. If I grab the box here, it doesn't really come in a box. It comes in like a cardboard sleeve that surrounds the actual box, which is this red and black 3D printed plastic travel case. Inside you find the IEMs themselves sort of here, and then underneath you'll get the cable and the ear tips, and that's it. You get silicone standard bore and a single pair of foam tips, and as you can see, nothing else. This case is massive, and it's designed in such a way where if you want to put anything sort of in the bottom here, you have to use this foam insert to sort of keep things from sliding around and hitting the sides of the box. So if you go without that foam insert, what you put inside is going to be rattling around unless you secure it in place with the top foam brick. That limits its usability a little bit. And I just think that, while this case looks cool, it isn't very well thought out from like a usage perspective. It feels like it's more a shipping container for the IEMs rather than an actual like legit travel case. It doesn't really fit in a pocket. You have to use the original packaging. I don't think it qualifies as a travel case. For $230, I feel like this level of included accessories is a big swing and a miss. It's quite disappointing. Let's hope they make up for it with the sound quality and the overall build. Let's take a quick look at the cable. Honestly, the cable for me is a bit of a mixed bag. The cable itself, the sort of wire bit, is quite nice. I really like the dark silver color. I like that you can see the individual conductors mixed with like a cable from like a suspension bridge. It's really, really nice. It feels good in the hands. It's a 4-wire twist that goes in, it's a 4-wire braid that goes into 2-wire twists at the Y split. It's not rubbery feeling. It feels good in the hands. It feels like a very high quality conductor was used in this cable. Where it all comes falling down for me is with the choice of hardware that they have here. So the 3.5 millimeter connector is all plastic and it's unbranded, and you can unscrew it extremely easily, just with your hands here. That is the case for other connectors, but this sort of plastic carbon fiber with a screw top connector, I've seen that before in some do-it-yourself cable kits. The Y split is more of the same, and it's held together with a grub screw that I'm sure if you popped off, you could undo this whole thing. The chin slider is a single large bead, which means it actually works extremely well, slides up and down easily and holds the grip. And the 2-pin connectors are the same sort of plastic with very clear LNR markings on them. I don't know why they're using sort of recessed style connectors on a non-recessed IEM. It doesn't really make that much sense to me. I've complained about this before on other IEMs, but again, if you're going to use recessed connectors, actually use recessed sockets on the IEM. These ear hooks are a bit of a problem for me personally. I'll talk about them a little bit later. In terms of comfort, they're fine, but the overall shape and the sort of radius of the bend is a bit of a problem in terms of comfort for me. I will, discuss that later. Yeah, overall, this is a really fantastic feeling cable that I feel is really let down by the hardware. It's not bad hardware, but this is the sort of stuff that you find, like I said, on sort of DIY cable builds. Like if you order a cable from a guy on Reddit who's building them, you'll probably get an option to use hardware like this. If you've bought, cable hardware online to build your own cable, you see options like this. And uh, I feel like this on a $230 IEM is not really great. I expect a little bit more at this price range than what is essentially a really, really nice cable with some sort of cheap-ish DIY hardware on it. In terms of build quality and construction, the shells on the Grit are fairly typical. You get a full resin build as you would expect from sort of IEMs in this price range. I feel like it's fairly typical these days, whether you like that or not. The nozzles here are metal inlaid into the bottom part of the shell, and you have a fine metal mesh filter on the end to protect from debris. If I pull out my flashlight and I shine a light on these, you can see that there's a large chamber here. You can see the dynamic driver there in the top. You also have both BAs in two pairs sitting there, so one close to the nozzle and one over there to the top. And then up here, you can see there's a sort of dividing line in the plastic where it becomes much more solid. And then that circle there is the bone conduction driver. So that's the sort of internal layout that you can spot from the outside with a light. The vent holes there on the back, as you can see when I lit it up there, they aren't sort of channeled or connected to anything. They're just sort of venting the entire open part of the shell there. That is the only source of ventilation for this IEM. Now, while I personally did not experience any sort of driver flex or pressure buildup issues on these, I have seen reports online of people experiencing pressure buildup with the Grit. So if you're sensitive to that, I would maybe not get these. Outside of that, though, I feel like the Grit is built just like every other full resin shelled IEM at this price point. The resin quality appears to be quite good. I would expect it to be about as durable as basically anything else built this way. So let's go ahead and take a look at what makes the Grit tick. This is a 6-driver Tribrid IEM featuring a 10mm dynamic driver with a biocellulose diaphragm. You also get 4 balanced armatures in 2 pairs, 2 for the mid-range and 2 for the treble. Finally, the Tribrid configuration is completed by an 11mm bone conduction driver of unspecified type. When it comes to drivability, the Grit is surprisingly easy to push with an impedance of 16 ohms and a sensitivity of over 100. I had no issues pushing these with my older Sony Xperia phone or my CD Walkman. While the cable itself adds a bit of heft to the setup, the shells themselves are just under 6 grams each, which is nice and light. The nozzles aren't too big compared to others, so these should be pretty comfortable, all things considered. And being a hybrid IEM with electronic crossovers, the sound on the Grit will be affected if you sort of mismatch the impedance with your source, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. If you are thinking about swapping that cable with something else, the resistance of the stock cable is 0.2 ohms, which I think really shows the quality of the conductors that they're using here. Overall, for a bone conduction Tribrid, fairly typical. Nothing too stand out in terms of specifications here. But now it's time for the cool wall. In my opinion, this is one of the aspects of the Grit that works the best. The face plates actually look really, really nice on here. They look like, to me, they're made of carbon fiber shards suspended in a sort of resin with some gold fleck at sort of different levels that catches the light in different ways. This is a case where your mileage will vary based on which exact unit you get. A lot of these IEMs that have the sort of hand-finished, hand-assembled faceplates will have slightly different looks to them. I've seen some people online with lots of gold flake in theirs or very little gold flake, bigger chunks here and there depending on where they are. I feel like I got relatively lucky. I got a decent amount of gold that catches the light pretty well. If I'm honest, this is the better looking of the two shells. My left one has a good bit less gold in it, which is not as exciting, and I kind of like they look different, but I wish that they were a bit more consistent. Assuming that you end up with a good looking distribution of gold and carbon, I think these belong in cool all day any day. I think they did a good job with these. But let's see what the Council of Ladies has to say about the Grit. First of all, a little bit of background. When I send these IEMs to the Council of Ladies, I don't just send them the images from the store page. I send them the store page pictures from the website. I also send them pictures of my specific units from different angles, as well as a picture of them in my wife's ears. This way they can compare them sort of an expectation versus reality way. So let's see if they think that these are pretty. It looks like we've got mixed results here, 2 each for pretty and meh, with a single no in there. As far as compliments go, however, we get 3 to 2 against, which is to be expected with the results that we had earlier. But now for their thoughts, and it looks like they're in agreement with me. Some of them say the gold is a bit subtle or, not consistent in the shells. Again, this is a common issue for what I call those sort of hand-finished or hand-built faceplates. The consistency in sort of swirl patterns, glitter distribution, glitter appearance isn't consistently great and can lead to some less than desirable results. So it's just something to keep in mind if you're going to be buying these for the looks. Comfort was kind of a mixed bag for me. At first, the Grit and I just didn't seem to get along. Something about the radius of these cable hooks just didn't sit well with my ears. It felt like the slightest tug or pull on the cables caused them to twist in my ears. The top part of the hook just didn't grab anything on my ear. It was a very weird sort of ear hook experience. I did eventually solve the problem by angling the IEMs a bit more forward than I typically do. But if I was going to be daily driving these, I would probably take a hairdryer to those hooks and reform them so that they fit my ears better. Once I figured that out, the comfort was honestly mostly fine. I was able to wear these for long periods of time with no real discomfort, but I wouldn't say that these disappeared into my ears. The shells are a bit on the larger side. The inside looks a bit hollow. I think they could have maybe made these a little smaller, but they are quite big, and I'm going to say, these were some of the less comfortable IEMs that I've been able to wear for a long period of time. So while they're still comfy, they're not as comfy as some of the other things that I've been able to wear for long times. Overall, these do get a pass from me. They do not, however, get a pass from my wife. She couldn't wear these at all. They were an instant fail on the tiny ears test. It was hilarious watching her try to put these in her ears. The radius of the ear hooks was way too big for her. They offered no support for the shells whatsoever. For her, any tension on the cable or any pulling on the cable immediately made them fall out of her ears, and there was zero chance that she could wear these for any appreciable length of time. So, not for the small-eared amongst you. Okay, as is typical for this bone conduction series, before we jump into the sound, we're going to talk briefly about the bone conduction effects that I experienced with these. In a word, the bone conduction effects on the Grit are subtle. It reminds me of sort of a toned-down version of the bone conduction in the Pinon Fan 3 or in the BQ-EYZ Wind. It feels like it's active in the bass, like the Flip Ears Legion, but it's not as present in the bass as the Flip Ears Legion or the KB Ear KBO2, for example. It's very subtle. It doesn't really buzz or rumble in your ears the way that those other two can. I honestly wish it did a bit more down in the bass, especially since you do get the hollow, springy tonality from the KB2 here. If you sort of touch the shells or bump them against each other, you do get some of that springiness there. When you're wearing them, it isn't as bad as on the KBO2, and even touching them here to feel the springiness, it isn't as bad as the KBO2. I think it's down to the fact that they have them in that really solid, like hard plastic shell there. It wasn't super annoying. My voice wasn't echoing or reverberating as much when I was listening to myself while video editing. There were still those annoying springy tonalities when I was clearing my throat or touching and bumping the shells while they were in my ears, but it wasn't as distracting or as deal-breaking as it could be in the KBO2 for things like spoken word content or certain YouTube videos. Overall, I don't personally feel like the bone conduction driver makes its presence felt in the Grit, unless it's doing something sort of unnatural with the tonality. It does do some positive things in terms of soundstage in some instances, but I'll talk more about that a little bit later. Starting off with the bass. The bass on the Grit is solid. You've got a good sub-bass grunt and a nice mid-bass punch that I feel adds good impact to bassier music. It does that without dominating the overall tonality or tuning of the IEM, however. The bone conduction driver is active down here with certain drops and notes. The deeper drops in W&W's Live the Night collaboration with Hardwell and Lil Jon makes the bone conduction driver respond pretty well. I can feel a tiny rumble in my ears. It is accompanied by that slight springy tonality, but again, it's not overwhelmingly bad or hollow like it is on the KBO2. The kick drums and bass guitar sound nice with this bass boost. The iconic bass line at the beginning of Rush's YYZ, for example, sounds really good on the Grit. It has nice tonality, the strings rumble well, the kick drum that comes with it adds richness to the sound, it has good presence. Overall, I would say, even though the bone conduction driver isn't doing a ton of work down here, it does contribute to a rich bass presence that I think is really good on this set. The boosted bass has a small effect on the mid-range here. Male vocals are ever so slightly darker, huskier, and a bit grittier than normal. Sultans of Swing by Dire Straits, for example, I think sounds quite nice on this. The bass guitar, again, has that excellent texture. There's no masking issues where one instrument can cover up another. Mark's voice sounds pretty great, honestly, with that little bit of added darkness, and I think the tonality here works overall in favor of the song. Fortunately, female vocals here are untouched and actually are on a bit of a pedestal. Garnadelia's Error, for example, has Maria's vocals as the focus of the track, and the grit helps push them sort of more forward than I feel is normal. She comes through very cleanly, very clearly over the electronic bass, the strings, the instruments, all of the tonal things that are happening in the song. She's right up front, and you don't mistake her for being the focus on this track. The mid-range here on the grit is natural and I would say well executed. It's quite good. The bone conduction driver works decently well in this range, but it doesn't seem to emphasize or take away anything from the music. It just sort of blends in, if you will. At best, it adds some good weight to certain notes at passages, and at worst, you don't notice it at all. As we move into the upper mids and treble, we find that the boosted upper mids help out female vocal harmonics in a really good way, and the treble is actually quite subdued. It isn't as sparkly or dynamic as I normally would like, but it certainly helps the vocals stand out sort of even more. A good example would be Madonna's Vogue. That song has a lot of percussion energy with the cymbals, the hi-hats, and the drums going on in the background. And on the grit, all of the spotlight is on Madonna's vocals and not really much else. The echo, the harmonics thrown off by her sort of breathy delivery, the backing vocals in each ear, they're all very easily audible and the harmonics decay very naturally. There's no sort of off tonality to them. The decay is very clean. Another good example would be Gloria Estefan's 1-2-3. On both this and Vogue, the percussion is present and sounds tonally correct, but to me it sounded just a little bit soft. It's almost like the airiness is a little bit lacking here. The treble isn't really what I would call the focus of this tuning. It's just a little bit soft, smoothed over. It's got what I would call just barely enough energy so that everything sounds accurate and clean and nothing more. If you're treble sensitive, this is probably a pretty decent set for you, as it's got pretty good resolution and you can still distinguish sort of edge hits from bell hits on cymbals. But you can tell that for the treble and the upper mids, the vocal harmonics are definitely the focus of this tuning as opposed to the percussion and instrument harmonics. Coming to the technical performance, I feel this is one of the areas where the grit is weakest in my opinion. The low end is honestly pretty well done. The low frequency details here are nicely resolved. Louis Armstrong's A Kiss to Build a Dream On has this big acoustic double bass in the background, and the buzzy, thumpy strings come through very well on the grit, and you can sort of almost hear the texture of the fingers rolling off of the strings. It works very well on this set. The bone conduction driver helps the low end have a little bit of extra dimension, and while there's still some instances where the bone conduction does get in the way of the driver in terms of tonality, they weren't as prevalent as on the more affordable sets. At the higher end, the tuning I feel is working against the two BAs that are up here in the treble. Their presence is very seldom felt, I feel. The treble in general, as I mentioned, is pretty subtle, and it can make details that are there seem a little bit harder to hear. Y'all know I like to use the live version of Bill Evans's Waltz for Debbie at the Village Vanguard to test for this sort of thing. And honestly, while I could hear some of the plates and glasses being cleared in the background, I had to focus on them a little bit more than usual to kind of make them out. They're still there, just barely, and as I said, you will have to focus a bit more to hear them. Overall, in terms of technical performance, when compared to other hybrid IEMs, I would put this somewhere between the 7Hz Sonus and the Supermix 4. I would say at or just below the level of the AFUL Explorer. When it comes to stereo separation and soundstage, here is where I feel that the bone conduction driver seems to be doing the most work. It will vary from track to track. For example, my typical Mediterranean Sundance test for stereo separation, it didn't really gain any width or openness compared to a normal hybrid IEM. And while the stereo separation was good, it wasn't anything incredible or standout. For acoustic guitars, it was just sort of average. It was a similar story with the perceived 3D soundstage. Juanes' La Historia de Juan, for example. Uh, I think that track benefits pretty well from the bone conduction. The bass guitar and the percussion seem to trigger the effect well, and you get a sort of wider than normal presentation. To sum things up, I would say that the soundstage and stereo separation are going to vary from sort of average to a bit above average for IEMs at this price point. It all is going to come down to how the bone conduction driver interacts with your specific songs. Real quick, I wanted to mention the effects of higher output impedance and impedance adapters on the sound of the Grit. I'm going to go ahead and pull up the graph for y'all. As you can see, a 15 ohm impedance adapter has a sort of warming effect on the Grit. It boosts the bass and cuts the treble. Personally, this isn't what I would call something desirable. I would be very careful about using the Grit on higher impedance sources, as the treble is already pretty subdued, and reducing it further really is going to darken the tonality overall. I 100% prefer the Grit without the impedance adapter, so go ahead and watch your sources on this one. So in terms of overall tuning, the Grit comes off to me as a sort of warmish, vocal emphasized, neutral-ish type set. It's an interesting tuning in that it's bassy, but also has good focus on female vocals, but also has sort of a subdued treble. I do have one pretty darn close budget sound-alike for this time, but as far as the rest of the comparisons go, I've gone ahead and decided to look in sort of the price range at and around the Grit. In my opinion, the $200 to $350 price range is very, very competitive right now. So I think we need to see how this stacks up against the competition. As far as bone conduction goes, as I said, the Grit reminds me most of the BQEYZ Wind and the Panon Fan 3 in that the effects of that bone conduction are very subtle, and the main effect on me and my ears seems to be a bit of a soundstage boost. I will say quickly that of the three, the Grit is the least effective in that way. The Fan 3 and the Wind are much more consistent in sort of increasing the soundstage of your music, while the Grit here is very hit or miss in terms of what it actually does in terms of soundstage. You do get a bit more bass impact than the other two, but again, it's going to depend on the track, and the tonality isn't always as accurate. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into the comparisons. Go ahead and kick things off with our budget sound-alike. It's the soon-to-be replaced Tangzu Warner SG at $19 US. In all actuality, the Apevoix Grit reminded me a lot of the OG Tangzu Warner. Both of these are what I would call bassy, female vocal forward sets with rich lower mids and what in my opinion is a sort of subdued, smoothed over, relaxing treble presentation. The Warner to me actually came off as having a little bit more sparkle at the top end compared to the Grit. It isn't by much, and the Grit is certainly more detailed and resolving if you're sort of really listening, but you know, there is an extra sparkle here. If you have the Warner and you've been looking to upgrade to something with more details, better build quality, nicer cable, go ahead and check out the Grit. The bone conduction experience isn't super consistent, but when it works well. Just be aware the shells are much, much larger than they are on the Warner. So yeah, I think good budget sound-alike, good upgrade if you want maybe a little bit of that bone conduction magic and you really dig the sound here. Moving up in price, we come to the Simgot Supermix 4, priced at $150 US. The Supermix 4 here is heavily Harman inspired in its tuning, and with that comes the sort of leaner mids, brighter, airier presentation compared to the Grit. The main reason I brought the Supermix 4 here is that these two deal with female vocals in a very similar way. They both put quite a spotlight on them, but the Grit is a far more relaxing sound than the sort of contrasty, exciting, sparklier sound on the Supermix 4. What I'll say is, if you like the way the Supermix 4 did vocals, but it was overall fatiguing for you to listen to, maybe check out the Grit. You'll get similar vocal presentation, but with a lot less overall treble energy. You will take a hit on overall detail. The Supermix 4 is the more resolving set here, but if the bone conduction works for you, you'll get some more texture on the low end and a bit more sound staging on certain tracks. It's worth looking into, I think. Moving on, we have the Ziigaat Odyssey, priced at $230, exactly the same as the Grit here. The Odyssey is going to be joining what I'm going to call the neutral-ish club in this price range, but when it comes to the bass, these two are honestly quite similar. The bone conduction driver in the Grit gives it a bit of a texture edge down low, but the differences between these two are honestly further up the range. The Grit is much, much more vocal forward than the Odyssey, but the Odyssey comes off as more resolving, more detailed, while still sparkly, while not being fatiguing. I personally would say that the Grit would be the choice for a vocal focused listener who maybe wants to try out bone conduction, while the Odyssey is a much better overall all rounder in terms of overall sound. Speaking of all rounders in this price range, we come to my IEM of the year for 2024, the AFUL Performer 7, priced $10 more at $240. The Performer 7 here is a similar story to the Odyssey. Its bass here has better overall texture than the Grit, and the P7 also wins in overall terms of resolution, treble energy, resolving ability, and so on. But the Grit can do special things with female vocals and sound staging that are sort of helped out by that bone conduction driver. Overall, again, like with the Odyssey, the Performer 7 is a much more well-rounded set with more upside potential here, whereas the Grit is more female vocal focused and has some of that more subdued treble tonality that we've been talking about. So to quickly sum everything up, the Warner, sort of a baby Apevoix Grit, lacks the bone conduction driver and the resolution of the more expensive set, but has a little bit more sparkle. The Supermix 4, definitely brighter, bit better bass, leaner mids, but these two treat female vocals in a very similar way. If you can handle this one, go for this one. If you want something a bit more subdued and more relaxing, but still keep the female vocals, the Grit is a good option. The Odyssey is probably the most neutral sounding set on this table. But the Grit, as I mentioned, much, much more forward with those female vocals. If you're looking for something neutral, this might probably be it. Finally, the Performer 7, of everything on the table, it is the most detailed and technically proficient, but it can't do what the Grit can do with female vocals. Basically, in the whole $200 to $350 price range, the Grit is trading technical performance and resolution and treble energy for the bone conduction magic that it's got going on and some pretty fantastic female vocal focus here. Okay, I went ahead and cleared the competition away because it's time to see where the Apevoix Grit is going to wind up on the Audio Amigo Arbitrary rating scale. The Grit here was a difficult IEM for me to rank. If we're putting it up against bone conduction IEMs, the effect is super subtle, to the point where even mid-range focused bone conduction IEMs like the Pinon Fan 3 and the Wind are more consistently, sort of good in terms of soundstage increase because of the bone conduction. This does have a bit more bass effect, but the KB Ear KB02, the Canera Plutus Beast, those will provide more of that tactile, buzzy bass experience than the Grit does. Now, the Grit won't have the usability concerns that those two have. It's much more listenable. You can actually use this for spoken word, and you still have some of that springy tonality, but it's nowhere near as bad. It doesn't approach the Flip Ears Legion in terms of bone conduction energy and no drawbacks, but that set is much, much more expensive than this, and it's really not a competitor. Thinking in terms of pure music playback, I feel that the Grit actually falls behind basically most of its peers in the price class. Yeah, it's special when it comes to female vocals. It does really nice things for female artists, but I don't think that it necessarily competes well with things like the Performer 7, the Odyssey, or some of the other sets in this price bracket. I think when you look at the accessories package, the overall technical performance, the fact that the bone conduction might be a wash for you and your ears, I think that this is actually a pretty hard sell at $230. To me, this is a specialist set, and for that reason, I'm going to go ahead and put it in the good tier. Because honestly, it is good. Female vocals are very nice. It's a special sound for sure. The bone conduction worked well for me on some tracks. It was fun. The design is pretty nice, and the treble presentation, while very subdued and lacking in airiness, still has the details that I would expect of a hybrid IEM. I just think that at $230, it's a very, very hard set to recommend, sort of blanket to everyone. The fact that you get a, awesome, gorgeous cable with low rent hardware, a case that you can't really daily drive and only one set of silicone tips, it doesn't really help it much in the value proposition. So, time for my recommendation, because I do think there is an audience for the set, and I think that audience will really like it. As I've been saying, this is a specialist set. It does female vocalists extremely well, particularly if the songs are mastered so that there's good emphasis on the bass and the vocals. So if you've got a library packed to the brim with 80s girl pop, city pop, J-rock, J-pop, K-pop, anime songs, soundtracks, all that stuff, this might be an excellent set for you, especially if you're treble sensitive. I think this could be your answer. If you love all those genres, but you've been sort of suffering from a bit of treble sensitivity, the subdued treble on this set could be exactly what the doctor ordered. Overall, though, I recommend, if you're looking at this, you try to get this on sale. If you watch this review and you're really interested in the Grit, keep an eye out on the upcoming summer sales. I think this does have good potential for discounts. We'll see. At MSRP, I really, really only recommend it if, like I said, you've got a library packed with those genres that I've mentioned and you are treble sensitive. But that's going to wrap up part 3 of my little bone conduction mini-series. The Grit is an interesting little set. I really wish they had either turned up the bone conduction a bit to make it more effective over more of the frequency range, or honestly removed it altogether and lowered the price. I still think the carrying case is cool, even if it isn't practical. But I just wish it maybe had a little pouch inside it so that you could have something to daily drive, even if this is going to live at home most of the time. But that's going to be it for now. I really hope you all enjoyed this review. Thank you all so much for watching. My next 2 videos are going to be something a little bit different, so keep an eye out for those. But yeah, this has been Omar with Audio Amigo Reviews, and I'll catch y'all next time.